And by now, we've seen these figures a couple different times. This is how we've been representing the relationships between the different authoritative institutions of democracy, mainly the legislature and the executive. And we spent a lot of time discussing the difference between parliamentarism and presidentialism, represented here. And we talked about how there's more of a role for the electorate in a presidential system because as the voter, we elect both the legislature and the executive in such a system. Whereas in a parliamentary system, we elect the legislature, which in turn chooses the executive. But we also differentiated between a semi-presidential system and a presidential and a parliamentary one. We talked about how a semi-presidential system involves really two executives, a president who is directly elected, but also a prime minister and cabinet who are produced by a directly elected legislature. And this is an interesting mix because it seems to combine elements of both parliamentarism and presidentialism. And I just was wondering, you know, in your opinion, or as far as you can tell, is semi-presidentialism the best of both worlds, or is it something else? Is it a mix of the two, or does it give us, the best aspects of the two, or are we stuck with the drawbacks of the two? What do you think? What is your opinion based on our discussion of these so far? Does anyone have a point of view that they would like to share? So Aramis asks, don't most executives end up being relatively powerless? So like presidents, you mean, Aramis? So remember that, like in the case of France, they're not powerless, right? Because they do have the power to veto legislation, and they are effectively a veto player. Whereas, the Queen in the UK sort of does too, but it's really more symbolic, right? And the Queen is not elected, and she has fewer powers than the French president does. So it's a little bit different, and they do have some influence and some role. And remember that in the case of France, cohabitation occurs when different parties control the presidency and the cabinet. And in that situation, there's that tension between the two, which suggests that there is a sort of legitimate role for the president in terms of like what they can do and get accomplished. Christopher says glass half full for me, so I will say yes to best of both worlds. Finland was an example of semi-presidentialism in the reading, right? As far as I know, I actually can't say with certainty. I can't remember what Finland was categorized as, so I won't say, but it may be that Finland is a semi-presidential system. Peru is a semi-presidential system. Or Bolivia is, pardon me. Giovanni says, I'd say it makes the process a lot more complicated than it has to be. Accountability is hard enough as it is. Okay, touche, right? When you add more veto players and when you add more institutional players, it does become more complicated, right? And now we have to sort out not just the relationships between, say, the legislature and the president, but also the relation between the legislature, the president, and the prime minister. So I'm glad that you're picking up on some of the complicated features of semi-presidentialism. Cohabitation in France is complicated, right? Cohabitation as a concept implies diversity and difference it implies a multitude of actors, and that maybe there's more room for disagreement or for conflict. Cohabitation in France was always interesting, but until 2001, precisely because of those areas for disagreement. And since the term of the prime minister and the president have been aligned, cohabitation happens less frequently, but it can still occur, and it can still be quite complicated governing and producing legislation and managing the day-to-day affairs of the country, more so maybe than say in the UK, where the Queen is sort of the head of state, but symbolically, and maybe has fewer formal powers than say the French president. Christopher says more checks is better. Less concentration of power is good if working together for common states. Okay, so more checks is better. That's one perspective, right? If we value checks and balances, maybe introducing more checks is useful. The election process and institutions for democracy will play a key role in the best of both worlds. Okay, so it might depend, right? It might depend on, say, the number of political parties in the system. For instance, do you think that having many parties and a lot of fragmentation might make it more complicated to have a semi-presidential system? You might have cohabitation more frequently than you would if you had, say, two major parties, right? So the political system and the party system might have something to do with the functioning of the system. For instance, if Ecuador had a semi-presidential system instead of a presidential system, it would be more complicated because Ecuador has a lot of parties. And Ecuador also has a unicameral legislature, which helps to make governing a little bit easier, given that the country historically has had lots of political parties. So then you can think about how legislatures and executives might affect each other, and how the party system might affect the functioning of the executive and the functioning of the executive legislative relationships. Efren says, I would say that the semi-presidential system is more complicated. Its weakness is that it depends on political parties. I find it a weakness because either party has a different agenda and can conflict with governance. So Christopher says more parties is better. It's possible, though, that more parties can be too cumbersome, right? Like if you have too many parties, it might be impossible to agree on anything. And so there might, though, be a point of no return where too many parties becomes problematic or cumbersome. There's probably a sweet spot somewhere in the middle where you have a balance of interests and accountability and a dispersion of power that helps to represent lots of different groups in society. Okay, so now that we've discussed and covered these three basic types of executive legislative relationships, I want to begin to evaluate the consequences of these different systems and talk about how the differences between parliamentarism and presidentialism can become consequential for the functioning of democracy and the stability and the orderliness of the democratic process. And our starting point is this old belief and this old thought that presidentialism undermines democracy. You know, it used to be the case that we thought that presidential democracy has features that make it prone to crisis and prone to breakdown and disorder and destabilization and the eventual replacement of democracy with authoritarianism. And these features relate closely to the functioning of the presidential systems as we've described them. In the first place, scholars pointed to how the executive and the legislature survive independently. Remember how we directly elect both the legislature and the president. And they referred to this as the problem of dual democratic legitimacy. And they argued that since these two institutions survive independently of each other, they are going to be prone to gridlock or disagreement or situations where they come at odds and they can't resolve the disagreement and the democracy breaks down. This is the problem of dual democratic legitimacy. The second problem with presidentialism, according to this old belief, is that fixed terms for both the president as well as potentially the legislature, uh, obviously the legislature. I'm confusing parliamentary and presidential systems. These fixed terms result in inflexible governance because presidents who are in office for 4 to 6 years know that they won't be taken out of office. They survive for the entirety of their term, and they don't have to respond to changes in the society or in the environment. And therefore, they can govern in a very rigid way, and they don't have to be flexible. The idea was that this rigidity that comes from these fixed terms for presidents and legislators means that you won't have the kind of sort of flexible and nuanced, responsive government that is necessary in a modern, advanced democracy. The third argument, or the third belief or thought that fell under this thesis that presidentialism is prone to crisis, was that winner take all rules in the executive concentrate power. Remember that in a presidential system, the president picks their ministers, but that ultimately power is concentrated in the hands of that president. By design, the ministers are not co-equal participants. Power is concentrated in the hands of the president. The argument was this concentration of power that results from winner take all rules is going to undermine democracy because it lets presidents govern in an authoritarian way. The fourth argument was that the absence of re-election for presidents results in a loss of political knowledge and a missed opportunity to engage in political learning or political adaptation that can be useful to the political system. Finally, they argued that because in a presidential system, we directly elect the president, there's always the possibility that voters will elect outsider presidents like Donald Trump, presidents who don't have political experience, who may not have a political party, and generally speaking, are more inclined to abuse other institutions or not follow democratic norms or procedures. Now, for all these reasons, it was argued that presidentialism is prone to crisis and that it's prone to breakdown, and that democracy is likely to go up in flames in the face of these various crises and breakdowns and moments of tension. And they argued further that because of all of this, parliamentarism is the antidote. They said that parliamentary democracy resolves all of these problems and will help to contribute to democratic survival where presidentialism is prone to break down. Now, we're setting this up so that we can tear it down. not because this old thought process and this old argument, this old thesis is necessarily correct. I'm telling you up front that we know better now. There is some evidence that parliamentary democracies do survive longer than presidential ones, but it's not clear that this is due to the features of parliamentarism, partly because it's difficult to rule out the role of region and to rule out region-specific factors. But we're setting this up so that we can acknowledge the argument and so that we can identify the different pieces of the argument. Based on our understanding of presidentialism, all of this does follow relatively seamlessly from the way it works as we've discussed it. Now, before we continue, let me consult the chat because I feel like several of you have commented. So Christopher has commented that he likes the last bullet point and that it's consistent with a lot of the discussion and polling in the class. And I actually want us to keep in mind that there may be more to this story and that in fact it might not be as simple as this old discussion and this old debate made it out to be. And indeed, let's discuss these arguments one by one. First of all, the claim of dual democratic legitimacy, the claim that in a presidential system, democracy will break down because the legislature and the executive survive independently. That's not an argument that is exclusive to presidential systems. Dual democratic legitimacy exists in parliamentary systems as well. For instance, if you have two legislative chambers in a parliamentary system, that is dual democratic legitimacy. There's nothing about the system that compels those two chambers to agree. They each can claim democratic legitimacy, and they can come into gridlock or disagreement. Secondly, there's dual democratic legitimacy between the prime minister and the head of state. Granted, the Queen in the UK is symbolic mostly and doesn't have substantial power. It still is an example of dual democratic legitimacy in the sense that both represent institutional power brokers in the system. And so we can't argue that presidentialism is more bound to break down because of dual democratic legitimacy, because that's a problem in both systems. Secondly, the problem of rigidity in fixed terms in the resulting inflexible governance. The truth is that most presidential systems have developed mechanisms for resolving inflexible governance and getting around fixed terms. Impeachment processes are used in a variety of presidential democracies on a regular basis to remove unpopular presidents who were otherwise elected for a fixed term. Recall elections have been used to remove unpopular presidents. Resignations forced by popular protests. All of these are examples of mechanisms used to mitigate the problem of fixed terms or rigidity in presidential systems. The point is that fixed terms don't need to be the end of democracy in a presidential system. We can easily resolve that problem by impeachment, a recall, or a resignation. Thirdly, winner-take-all rules in the resulting concentration of power. The truth is it depends on the electoral system. Proportional representation systems are much more proportional and far less majoritarian than majoritarian systems. And PR systems will tend to disperse power among parties according to the proportion of the vote that they received. In addition, checks and balances exist between the legislature and the executive in a presidential system. That is a founding principle of a presidential system. And so any concentration of power that results from the winner-take-all rules in the cabinet will be counterbalanced by check and balance relationships between the legislature and the executive. And then there's also the simple fact that coalitions are not uncommon in presidential systems, especially in multi-party presidential systems. Presidents can typically only govern when they form a coalition, and they're more likely often to choose ministers that resemble the composition of that coalition. And so the concentration of power characteristic of presidential systems actually depends much more on the electoral system. And it also depends on the size of the coalition and the number of parties in the coalition. And then finally, it's important for us to note that in a parliamentary system, fewer checks on the executive exist than in a presidential system, when in that parliamentary system, the prime minister enjoys a legislative majority with a single party and enjoys a cabinet with ministers from that same party. That arrangement constrains the executive far less than does any ordinary arrangement in a presidential system. And so if we're being honest about the concentration of power, prime ministers are typically stronger than presidents. And then finally, the principle of no reelection in the resulting loss of political knowledge and the loss of learning. Many countries have adopted reforms to allow reelection. So it's actually not true that presidential democracies prohibit reelection by design. Mexico is one example of a country that has not yet allowed presidents to be reelected, but many Latin American countries have adopted reforms permitting reelection. Some haven't, most have. Generally speaking, presidentialism can be adapted so as to permit the kind of political learning and knowledge generation that we would consider to be a benefit of parliamentarism in the absence of limits on reelection. When you put all this together, you notice that presidentialism is not prone to crisis by design. We can adapt presidentialism to mitigate some of those inflexible features. Presidentialism is also a system that does not exist in a vacuum. There are other institutional features of a political system, like the party system, the electoral system, that affect the functioning of the democracy as well. And when you consider all of this, it means that the choice between parliamentarism and presidentialism is not as easy as we thought. And generally speaking, presidentialism might be more functional and conducive to stability than we originally thought. Now, early on, in the early 2000s, scholars thought that presidential democracies were prone to crisis, partly because they were studying the Latin American cases, and they were noticing that in Latin America, where presidential democracy is the only type of democracy, many of the democracies were breaking down. And they concluded that presidentialism was flawed as a result. But over time, we've noticed that the Latin American democracies have begun to consolidate and strengthen. And presidential democracy in Latin America appears stronger than it did at that time. And it doesn't look like presidentialism is inherently flawed anymore. Of course, it's hard for us to know precisely the impact of presidential and parliamentary institutions because we have a difficult time ruling out the role of region-specific factors. European countries are mostly parliamentary, Latin American and African countries are mostly presidential. So it's hard for us to compare the experiences. But one thing that we can say is that presidentialism does not appear to be inherently prone to crisis. That being said, there is one feature of presidentialism that does appear to be problematic in the way that we originally thought. And that is the tendency for outsiders to win political power. Donald Trump is an example of an outsider. Donald Trump was directly elected by the American people. Many might argue that if we had a parliamentary system, Donald Trump never would have been elected because it would have been highly unlikely for the Republican majority in Congress to anoint Donald Trump as their prime minister. If you remember early on, Republicans thought Trump was a laughingstock. Republican voters supported Trump, but the main elites in the party didn't take him seriously. It was only after he won the election and the nomination that they had to take him seriously. It's unlikely that a Republican majority would have chosen Donald Trump if we had a parliamentary system and not a presidential system. But we had a presidential system, and we directly elected our president. And under that institutional context, outsiders do become more likely because it's not the political class choosing the executive, it's the electorate. And the resulting abuses of power by Donald Trump, by Hugo Chavez, by Fujimori have been serious and have been grave. And many would argue that the collapse of democracy in Venezuela was partly due to the rise of an anti-establishment populist figure in Hugo Chavez, who was directly elected, but who would have been unlikely to be anointed or selected by a legislative majority had Venezuela had a parliamentary system and not a presidential one. And so the rise of outsiders is a legitimate challenge and a legitimate problem when it comes to presidentialism. Of course, if you argue that the rise of outsiders is okay because the electorate is making that choice, if we value the autonomy of the electorate above all, maybe we accept the rise of outsiders as just a cost of doing business under presidentialism. But it's true that outsiders do represent a challenge for presidentialism and presidential democracy. Now, I'm curious what you all think about outsiders and outsider presidents. I'm curious if you think that the sort of the risk is overblown, if you think that outsiders are less problematic than we've made them out to be, or maybe if they are as problematic as we've made them out to be. Does the risk of electing an outsider, does that cast doubt on presidentialism? Should we be more suspicious of presidentialism because of the potential of the electorate to elect outsider presidents? What do you all think?
Do you mind if I talk? It's a bit slow
Go
to
ahead,
type
Eric.
it through. Yeah, and I'm curious to hear what everyone else thinks. But I feel like entrenched power, especially in our system, is a larger issue. So if we allow power to continue to be entrenched in these political classes, what you end up having is this sort of like a pseudo aristocracy or new aristocracy, especially in long-standing democratic systems. So anything that is capable of de-entrenching power, powerful people, might be beneficial to a system. Um, yeah, but I'm open to hear what everyone else has to say.
So the question is the risk of outsider presidents overblown?
Oh, then yes, the risk of outsider presidents is overblown, and we in America have very specific. We have Trump, right? We just had him. But another person who could be considered an outsider would be Bernie Sanders, who I'm pretty sure this college
No,
population
he's
would
not an
regard as
outsider. He has decades of political experience. An outsider president we define as a president without political experience. And so Christopher says here, an outsider, a noun, a person who does not belong to a particular group. Christopher, we have a literature on outsider presidents. And so we define it as presidents who are elected without prior political experience and who often lack a political party. And so the the question for us is, does the possibility of electing an outsider president, does that threaten democracy? Is there a risk to democracy that comes from that? And I think that we need to think seriously about that, because that is a possibility in a presidential system, whereas in a parliamentary system, it's virtually impossible because the political elite will choose someone like them. And so Karen says Donald Trump was known for being a businessman, and the people who elected him knew that he didn't necessarily have a strong background in politics. So popularity overshadows experience, it seems like. Giovanni says, I think the whole outsider thing was sort of ruined. Even if there were a possibility for good, was ruined. I do also think the current political system is elitist and doesn't allow for people like us. And so Aramis points out, last time we did end up very close to what could be considered a coup. What we know and what we found is that outsider presidents elected without political experience and often without a political party, are much more likely to abuse other political institutions. They're much more likely to try to carry out a self coup where they try to dissolve other institutions or declare themselves president for life. Fujimori did that in Peru. It's debatable, but it's arguably obvious that Donald Trump tried to bring about an insurrection or a coup, or the he tried to stop a process that would anoint a president who was not him. These sorts of abuses are committed much more regularly by presidents who are considered outsider presidents. And so these institutional abuses are obviously a part of the debate and the discussion about how presidentialism might impact democracy. And if we're being even-handed, we should consider whether that's a serious concern. And especially if people are voting for these outsiders because they're dissatisfied with democracy and they're dissatisfied with the political elites, it could be that presidentialism does contain the seeds of its own destruction. So we've been discussing some of the drawbacks of presidentialism and some of the potential strengths of parliamentarism. And I've tried to give you a nuanced take because I want us to understand that there are arguments to be made on both sides. It's not necessarily clear that parliamentarism is more or less democratic, or that presidentialism is more or less democratic. They have different features and they work in different ways. And so they might affect democracy differently. They, of course, function differently and they present voters with a different set of choices. In a parliamentary system, you don't have the choice of presidential candidate or candidate for the executive because you only vote for legislator or the legislators in your district. In a presidential system, you're voting directly for the legislature and the president. And so some of the advantages of presidentialism come from the choices that we have as voters. And in the same way that we have the choice to elect an outsider, we have the choice and the possibility of assessing the different options that are available to us in a way that is not available to voters in a parliamentary system. And so in the first place, one of the real advantages of presidentialism is that it gives greater choices to voters. Direct election means that when you go to the polls, you have a choice not just for the legislature, but also for the president. And in that way, you're connected to the system in an additional way that you would not be in a parliamentary system. Secondarily, there's a lot more electoral accountability because you're able, for example, to vote for or against the incumbent president when they go up for election in a way that you're not able to vote directly for the incumbent party's prime minister, because even if you vote for that party will still have direct control over who that prime minister will be. There's always that layer of separation between the voter and the executive. And in that way, there's less accountability in a parliamentary system, and there's more accountability in a presidential system. Similarly, you can identify your electoral options. In a presidential election, you might have, any number of choices. In the most recent US election, really we had, two feasible, viable choices, but realistically, there were a lot of different candidates who you could have voted for. And in that identification of options meant that voters had greater choice and greater leeway and more involvement in the eventual outcome. And then finally, Congress has independence. So far, we've primarily been talking about voters and the perspective of the voter, but Congress itself is also an actor whose independence and autonomy is worth considering. When we vote for the president and vote for the legislature, we're participating in a system that grants independence to the Congress that we elect. They survive independently of the executive, and they therefore can vote against the legislative initiatives of the executive without fear of new elections or the dissolution of the legislature. They can exert and use their power without fear of how not falling into line or supporting the executive might result in a loss of their power or some harmful outcome for them. And so in that regard, legislators have a lot more independence. They can become mavericks. They can control the executive and exert more control over the executive than they could in a parliamentary system, where a legislative defeat for the prime minister and the cabinet would very likely result in new elections and a new legislature. When you put all of this together, presidentialism may be as viable, if not more viable, than parliamentarism. And it may present us with a set of choices and a set of options that we value for as many, if not more, reasons than we do parliamentarism. And the point that I've tried to make to you in this discussion is that it's never as simple as we might think. And remember, when I showed you those figures and you noticed that the electorate has more of a responsibility and more power in a presidential system than they do in a parliamentary system. And noticing that was enough to sway most of you and to change your mind about what alternative was potentially more democratic. In my opinion as well, there's a lot to be said for presidentialism in the way that it empowers voters, in that it creates an opportunity to hold presidents and incumbents accountable. It provides us with an opportunity to identify options and to elect an independent legislature that can hold the executive accountable without fear of the dissolution of the legislature in the event of a legislative defeat for the prime minister. That means then that presidentialism might be more useful to us and more likely to survive and promote democracy than we ever thought. And in fact, we can even go further. Parliamentarism itself has become more presidential in recent years. Parliamentary systems have begun to undergo what we refer to as a process of personalization. In the presidentialization or the personalization of parliamentarism has had three phases. The first phase, the electoral phase, has involved a growing emphasis on leadership appeals or appeals to the qualities of the leadership of the prime minister in a way that is very similar to the focus on the qualities of the president in a presidential system. The executive phase has involved a growing shift of political power benefiting the head of the government. This has often meant more of a role for the government in leading the legislative agenda and leading and deciding the sort of direction of public policy. The third phase, the party phase, has involved a sort of concentration of power within the party in the interest of the prime minister in a way that is very similar to the concentration of power in the hands of the president in a presidential system. And this presidentialization of parliamentarism has really worked against the kind of consensual power dispersing qualities of parliamentarism that we originally associated with this model. And it's meant that, generally speaking, personalities are more important than ever before. And there are a couple of reasons for this process of presidentialization and this personalization. The first reason is that some of the original traditional social cleavages and linkages between parties and voters have begun to break down. New means of communication, new technological changes have begun to erode those linkages. And that means that there's less of a role and there's less influence for parties and programmatic relationships and policy based relationships between parties and voters. More of an emphasis on relationships between personalities and leaders who can represent parties in the kind of uh, debate and relationship between parties and voters. Secondly, the second reason is that TV and social media and electronic media overwhelmingly emphasize persona and personality. There's a de-emphasis on party and programmatic, policy oriented faces, and there's a focus on personalities, sound bites, individuals, and electronic media and TV in particular has really reinforced and driven this shift away from programmatic considerations and towards considerations of persona and personality and so on. And a good example of the personalization of presidentialism is Tony Blair, who is a former prime minister in the UK. And Tony Blair was infamous. He was very popular and very charismatic. He cultivated a direct link with voters in a way that really bypassed the party in the traditional cleavages and linkages between party and voter. Many analysts argue that he really adopted a presidential style of governing as well, in the way that power really revolved around him rather than the party and the majority. And the most important decisions in his party and within the government were made by him. And really within the cabinet in particular, there was a shift away from the kind of co-equal participation of ministers and towards this sort of informal concentration of political power around Blair. And this really was an example of the presidentialization of the parliamentary model. And Tony Blair was just the first example in a long series of examples from the European continent. We're actually going to watch a short video that helps to put this in perspective. It's actually it's a comedy sketch from the Catherine Tate Show, which is a British sketch comedy program that is hugely popular and basically just satirizes a lot of different, funny things from like current events and media and culture. And when Tony Blair was prime minister, he was a star in one of the skits on the Catherine Tate Show, and Lauren Cooper is one of the stars in the show. And in this skit, Lauren Cooper meets Tony Blair, and it's just supposed to kind of make a funny joke about how popular, frankly, Tony Blair is, and how important a figure he is, and kind of how much of a leader he became and emerged as in the context of UK politics. And just the whole point of the video is to sort of highlight his popularity and his persona and his stardom. And so it's an example of the presidentialization of UK politics, but it's very funny and it's sort of cheeky. Some of the humor is a little bit dated, and you'll notice what I mean. But keeping in mind that this is satire, let's watch it and try to get some kicks.
Are you Lauren Cooper?
Any day. I'm here for work experience.
We were actually expecting you at 9.
Yeah, I know, but Ryan had this party last night and he didn't invite me or nothing. So I bell him one time and I goes, what's all this about you having a party and not inviting me? And he goes, oh, you are invited, mate. And I goes, well, I don't care because I don't want to go anyway. But I did go and it was mash up.
Right. Well, would you like to follow me?
Who are these jokers?
These, young lady, are the portraits of every Prime Minister this country's ever had.
Is he a Prime Minister?
Yes.
Is he a Prime Minister?
Yes.
Is he a Prime Minister?
They're all Prime Ministers.
See all these pictures, right? See all these pictures?
Yes.
Are they all Rory Bremner?
Lauren, come on.
Is he a Prime Minister? Is he a Prime Minister? Is he a Prime Minister?
He's on a very important call, so you just take this in and then come straight back out.
Is he a Prime Minister?
Just get on with it.
Yeah, sure. No, we should be able to manage that.
Excuse
Okay,
me.
well, I think it should be possible.
Excuse me.
Yes, okay.
Excuse me.
Hello?
All right.
I'm on the phone.
I bought you some biscuits.
Anyway, I
Rich
think...
tea, is it?
Can I phone you back?
Was that someone famous?
No.
Have you ever seen anyone famous?
Well,
Who's the most famous person you've ever seen?
I really need to get on.
But you ain't even told me who the most famous person you've ever seen is.
I'm sorry, what's your name?
Lauren.
Lauren. I'm a bit pushed for time.
Shall I tell you mine?
Sorry?
Shall I tell you who the most famous person I've ever seen is?
Okay.
This is mental, man. You won't even believe it. I was out shopping with Ryan and Liz, they're my brethren, innit? But Liz had mooched off with some chav she met on the bus. She thought I was jealous, but I ain't even jealous, because he was wearing Harry Potter glasses and he had them wheels on his shoes.
Lauren.
Rolling up and down Oxford Street like a numpty.
Look.
So I goes to her, we're going to be in Nike Town, but lose the pikey because his heelie's going to get stuck in the escalators. Ryan had seen some well-nice trainers in Nike Town and he got a gift voucher for his auntie for his birthday. She ain't really his auntie, she's his dad's girlfriend. We ain't stupid. So we pitch up and we go right down to the children's section because they're cheaper, aren't they? And Ryan's only short, so his feet are only titchy. You wouldn't think it, right? But he's got proper little stumps for his feet, like them Japanese women who wear bandages in bed under their shoes.
Lauren.
Have you ever been to Centre Parks? We went out at half term and I was like, this is going to be well dry. But it was all right, you know, because they got 200 different types of restaurants, one for every mood. And they got a swimming pool with a wave machine, a bowling alley and a tattoo parlour, all under one big roof. It's like Butlins, but you don't get wet.
Lauren.
Yeah.
Am I bothered?
What?
Am I bothered, though?
What'd you say?
But I ain't bothered.
Right, you can't say that.
Look at my face.
Right, what are you doing?
Is my face bothered?
No, wait a minute.
Does my face look bothered, though?
No, are you messing with my mind?
Face bothered. Top shop, Centre Parks, trainers, small feet, rich tea, bandages, Ryan, Lise. I ain't bothered.
But you don't even know who the most famous person I've ever seen is.
I don't care, because I ain't bothered. Out.
Rubbish here. It was Ross Kemp.
All right. So the whole point is that Tony Blair became quite popular in his persona, rose above that of the parliament. And in this way, Tony Blair is an example of the presidentialization of parliamentarism. And so in the end, our final concluding point is that the differences between parliamentarism and presidentialism are important and they are consequential, but presidentialism is not more prone to crisis, and parliamentary systems are becoming more presidential as we go on. And so thank you very much, everybody. That does conclude our unit on executive legislative relations. I hope you have a wonderful weekend, and I'll see you on Friday. Excuse me, Monday.